English translation 538th contact Saturday, the 7th of April 2012, 14:05 hours.
There you are. I could just finish a few things. We were quick with the correction work today, which is good, because I have a few things we should discuss right away, which probably also requires you to call Quetzal on your device and get in touch.
What is it all about?
It should not be a big deal, but rather discussed under lock and key. This case is namely the...
We really should not discuss this in public. And it is probably also necessary that I make a connection to Quetzal, which I will do in a moment. That should clear things up regarding Sunday service. And as you have heard, Quetzal and I believe that the board, or rather the whole core group, should handle the matter sensibly at their own discretion. You should talk to about this, even though he is ultimately the one who has to decide what he can and cannot do. Regarding the other matter, however, it is very regrettable that despite all our efforts, nothing has been done for the better. So we stick to the proposal that we can contribute to this by this will certainly improve everything, at least in terms of general communication and understanding and peace and in general, etc.
It will probably be necessary for me to talk to outside the General Assembly, even if the matter can be settled at the General Assembly this evening. But as you say, he has to decide and decide for himself, because the core group cannot decide about his work and free time. And as far as the other things are concerned, we respectively, the core group, will follow your suggestion, which I also think is good, and which the whole core group will probably also think is good.
So everything will be to the satisfaction of all. Also regarding the things with the flats that are occupied by Pius, Patrick, and Michael, everything should be as correct as you have explained to me. And if all three are reasonable, which will certainly be the case, then nothing stands in the way of a settlement within the framework mentioned.
That is to be assumed, yes. But something else. Achim Wolf wrote and asked if you would say something about what is actually meant by a real democracy. He asked because we discussed this topic together in a contact conversation. You also mentioned to me privately that you would talk about it in more detail, but this is now forgotten. I would also be interested to hear what you have to say about it. Achim wrote the following.
Dear Elizabeth, during a contact in the year 2011, printed in Sim Yase, volume 25, Billy said to Peter that it would be good if Peter would say something about democracy. Could you please ask Billy if he could talk to Peter about it at some point, or if Peter could give a detailed explanation? Surely it would be of general interest, because it would be a valuable teaching and a guideline for the realization of true democracy among the human beings, which we Earth humans could strive to achieve. Achim.
I have indeed not thought of that anymore, but I am happy to keep my promise. But I must make it clear that the whole thing is entirely in line with our Playaran understanding of democracy and has nothing to do with the understanding of democracy among the peoples of the world. It is also not intended to be used to arouse suspicion that you are politically active and want to make a difference in relation to my statements in Switzerland. But if such suspicion were to be aroused, it would be equivalent to a lie and slander. And what I'm going to say in this regard must never be interpreted in such a way as to give rise to political and state subversion on Earth. My statements will only reflect what is planetary in relation to our democracy and how it is handled. I must also say that I must limit my explanations to a single conversation, because everything is far too broad, so I would have to talk about it several times and explain everything. But that would probably be going too far. Which is why, given the extent of democracy as we understand and handle it, I have to explain everything so briefly and yet in sufficient detail to give a clear picture.
It is good to mention that no politically or governmentally motivated subversive action should come out of it. because it must be understood that your explanations only reflect what is and is given in your country as democracy. The whole thing should not and must not be a guide to the fact that political subversive actions will result from it on Earth in any state. I also think, at least according to what I know about your Plejaran handling of democracy, that your understanding of democracy can hardly be realized in any state on Earth in the present time and in the near future. So I also resist the suggestion that I might be accused of being politically active and trying in any way to propagate something in the form of democracy as you will explain it.
This is the meaning of my words. My explanations are only intended to clarify the understanding and the state of democracy as it applies to us Plejaran. If there are to be decisive changes and changes for the better in a true democracy, then this requires changes which are deeply motivated, willing, absolutely peaceful and slow, and which are beneficial to the whole people. No insurrection, illogical violence, or coercion of any kind must ever be allowed to take place, either on the part of the people or of any group, or of the rulers and parties, etc., or of the military and security forces, etc.
Everything must therefore be in accordance with an absolutely peaceful overall will of the people, and must not lead to violence and coercion, and of course above all not to acts of terrorism.
Democracy requires that from all sides, that is to say, from the rulers, the parties, and the people, everything must be handled, transformed, and carried out uniformly and in peace, and that no violence, coercion, or reprisals are used by any side. A true democracy must therefore be built from the ground up without violence, coercion, etc., and consequently no acts of violence, coercion, or reprisals of any kind must be used by any side. And as an explanation of what we Plejaran understand by democracy, I will set out the following. It is about 52,000 years ago that true democracy was established among all peoples in our Plejaran, and with it a lasting peace and extensive freedom, which has also been established since then by prohibiting all undemocratic forms of government and their actions. This also led to the final peace among all peoples, so that since then the Plejaran have lived in true peace and freedom. For the peoples themselves want peace and freedom, but not war, despotism, or dictatorship. Wars, despotism, dictatorship, and tyranny of all kinds always come from rulers, from parties, parliaments, military and secret services, etc., as well as from rulers and their supporters and followers, but never from the peoples themselves, for they are fundamentally opposed to wars, discord and unfreedom, etc. The whole thing was based on the recognition that forms of government based on parliaments and parties or on dictatorship or republics, etc., are contrary to any true democracy and are a fraud against the peoples because they are deceived by untenable promises, propaganda and lies, etc. This is how our forefathers took as their starting point what has survived to this day and confirms our true form of democracy. That when the peoples have to make their own decisions under their own responsibility, their true and uninfluenced opinions are brought to bear. Contrary to this, it is a fact that no personality of their own and free decision is brought about if there are not popular leaders elected by the people. But some forms of government and parties which may influence the elections through propaganda, etc., as well as through vote buying and vote rigging or through violence and coercion. If any of these things are put up for election and the voters vote yes or no to them, then this is usually not their own opinion and vote, but one which is influenced and imposed by propaganda, violence, or by buying votes. This means, however, that true democracy and understanding of it are already stifled at the core, because it only allows people to vote for or against something and to be there without being able to express their own opinion responsibly, to speak out openly, and to be considered. As a result, all other voters are not allowed to express their personal opinions in public, which must be the opposite in a true democracy. But if all that is done is propaganda, if there is no open discussion of the matter, if all citizens who have something to say about it are not listened to, then this is dictatorial either way, determined by the rulers, parliaments, and parties. In this way, the people is only allowed to vote yes or no in an election, without the possibility of expressing a personal and direct opinion, therefore the vote cannot be justified. In a true democracy, however, every person called to vote must be able to express his or her free opinion about a pro or con, and be able to make clear what his or her view and opinion, as well as his or her desire and the reason for accepting or rejecting the person standing for election is. All forms of government which do not have an actual representation of the people elected by the people as a whole show that only the forces of government and parties are called to vote on predetermined matters, whatever the relationship and whatever the matters to be voted on. The individual citizen of any nation has nothing to say in this matter, which corresponds to nothing more and nothing less than a tyrannical and dictatorial system under the guise of an alleged democracy. So in any case, the big problem is always a form of government of this kind and all its instruments, which prevents true democracy. Such forms of government, however, lead to more or less serious conflicts in all peoples and social strata, and for the time being, of course, also in the parties, parliaments, government circles, and among the individuals themselves. This proves that the methods of elections and referenda of this kind are worthless and always lead to the failure of true democracy. Such a policy successfully conceals all approaches to a real solution of all problems, and the fact that any form of instrument of government is completely wrong and must be replaced by true popular leadership and democracy. If instruments of government are given and not true democracy and popular leaderships elected by the people alone, then governments constantly and inexorably provoke conflict because only that side of society is represented, which is always in accordance with the parties, classes, sects, rulers, and those in power, and which votes in their favor. Forms of government of all kinds, whether halfway good or bad, never represent the peoples and also do not act and speak in their name. But their actions and speaking are based only on their own plans and wishes, etc. This is what we Playaran are deeply aware of, that no form of government of any kind can ever represent the peoples, but only representations of the people as determined by the peoples. This realization was used by our ancestors to build a true democracy encompassing all peoples. Only a representation of the people for the people is democratic, whereas a representation is a fraud. And it was only through the recognition of this fact by our forefathers that the instrument of democracy could be brought into being and all the problems which had constantly led to popular discontent, as well as to discord, lack of freedom, and, in many cases, also to uprisings, revolutions, and war, as well as to immense destruction, could be solved. In this way, all-encompassing people's democracies were created and realized on our worlds, putting an end to all despotic and dictatorial forms of government and rulers, etc., and giving all power only to the peoples and implementing it through elected leaders of the people. And this has proved its worth, according to the earthly sense of mankind, for more than 52,000 years, and consequently there have never been any more uprisings, revolutions, popular discontent, or small or large wars since then. Thus, our distant ancestors as a whole have found the final solution to all political problems on all our worlds and have shown all peoples the way out of the path of the dictatorial rulers and ruled and into a true democracy based solely on the extensive power of the people, without representatives or substitutes. A true democracy must come about in a realizable, systematic and direct form of pure popular decision and elected leadership, and must distance itself from all forms of government which are totally undemocratic or only partially democratic. True democracy is an all-human problem which must be valid not only in politics but also in the whole circle of family, friends, and acquaintances, as well as in every community, whatever its nature. since the dawn of humanity. However, there have always been major and very serious problems in this respect, particularly because the concept of democracy is subject to a completely mistaken assessment and misunderstanding on the part of the human beings. As a result, all humanity which has not yet become a true democracy faces constant problems and many risks which cannot be overcome in terms of correct and peaceful, free and harmonious coexistence. The lack of understanding by all the human beings and peoples of the need for true democracy has the most serious consequences, usually causing strife among the human beings and war and terror among the peoples and states. But this makes it impossible in any way to bring about a real democracy, not least because religions are also involved with their beliefs, which give rise to hatred of those of other faiths and thus also to terrorism. And this not only affects families, friendships, and acquaintances, but also small and large communities and peoples, which basically suffocates any democracy before it can even produce or allow a seed to sprout. All family, friendly, community, and political systems cannot produce true democracy if everything is built on domination and power. Rule in the family, in a circle of friends and acquaintances, in a community, in a people, in a state and its organizations, etc. Rule, power, and hierarchy, then a comprehensive and true democracy is absolutely impossible. It is also irrelevant whether the rule, hierarchy, or power is exercised peacefully or by force, just as it is completely unimportant whether these forms of power are exercised by heads of families, community leaders, superiors, those in power in the state, as well as by religions, sects, individual persons or parties, etc. The result is always the same, namely that there is always a victory for those who exercise the rule and thus the power of the hierarchy. And it is through the fact that this instrument of domination can be brought to bear that all those who are subordinate to power and subject to it suffer defeat. But this is also a defeat for democracy because it is destroyed before it can even be formed in one iota. If a family, a friendship, a circle of acquaintances, a people or a state is led or governed by domination, hierarchy, and power, then the law of the strongest, ruling, and powerful always applies, which, however, truly corresponds to a dictatorship. This also applies when there is a system of parties in politics in which the members of the party are prescribed what they must support and oppose, because this too is not a democracy but a party dictatorship. If a political struggle is waged in a party-wise manner, then those who make the best promises, which they cannot keep, will win, and consequently everything can no longer be a lie and deceit. Such a party struggle is usually fought under the guise of democracy, but this is truly an infamous lie and intrigue, because it is the dictatorial machinations of a party dictatorship. And if there is no true and real democracy in the state and it prevails, then this rule also applies in the family, in every community, and in every circle of friends and acquaintances. This means, however, that the human being is not free to decide democratically and not according to his own view and opinion when something has to be decided, but that he is predetermined by the instrument of power how and for what he has to decide and how he has to act. It is therefore imposed on him to behave according to what is prescribed for him, and to raise his voice, and behave in such a way as is imposed on him as a duty by the rule. But this is no more and no less than a dictatorship that very quickly degenerates into a despotic regime for those who do not follow their dictates. This is the case in the family, among friends and acquaintances, in communities, among peoples and states, which inevitably leads to conflict, while also bearing in mind that the whole thing is fundamentally controlled and produced only by all the rulers and the powerful, those who run the families, friends, and acquaintances or the communities, and those who represent the parties, classes, peoples, and states. The rulers, the powerful and the hierarchical have power in their hands everywhere, so that they can control the majority of those who are subordinate and in bondage to them, while the minorities who are against their power, rule, plans, and machinations are oppressed and have to give in. Thus, within the circle of family, friends, acquaintances, communities, peoples, and states, some being is led by despotism or dictatorship, but no true and real democracy is cultivated, where parties, superiors, heads of families or leaders, etc., have the power to rule, to determine, as well as the hierarchical power, and thus the authority to rule. Even with the best will in the world, there can never be any talk of a democracy. In the very best case, one can perhaps speak of a partial democracy, in which family members, friends, acquaintances, and members of a community or the people have a say in certain things, but are generally excluded from them in important decisions. In such sub-democracies, the ruling, powerful, hierarchical, and ruling classes reserve the dictatorial right to exclude the foot people from any decision-making power and to negotiate and decide on certain matters on their own authority. It is not uncommon for the rulers, the powerful and the hierarchical, to feel arrogant and to have the mistaken opinion that, on the one hand, their foot soldiers are too stupid and unintelligent, or that, on the other hand, due to lack of time, etc., a quick decision must be made which does not allow the opinion of the foot soldiers to be sought first. And this blatant arrogance has generally prevailed from time immemorial in all those who are in power. Powerful, hierarchical, and governing, who have no idea of true and real democracy, and who consider all those they preside over to be consciously underfunded. This is how they think and act legitimately, and they are mistaken in their belief that their wrong ideas and thoughts and their dictatorial actions are democratic. In truth, however, under this cloak of false democracy, a full-blown dictatorship prevails. This is the reality of all those ruling. Hierarchical and power-based systems in families, in circles of friends and acquaintances, in communities, organizations, in social classes, among peoples, religions, sects, states, and in politics. Basically, it is purely despotic or dictatorial systems which, under the guise of true democracy, make these mockeries. In a true democracy, only the entire people have the right to appoint suitable and authoritative persons who, as leaders of the people, represent the will of the people alone. Such representatives of the people are not independent rulers. Rulers and powers but are only implementers of the desires and will of the people, who alone decide on everything and anything that has to be done and how something should be shaped and handled. Self-determining rulers, mighty people, and other self-determining officials, who must necessarily carry out all official duties and only have to fulfill their duties in accordance with the law, cannot be tolerated in a true democracy, nor can parties, other organizations, senates, parliaments, religions, sects, and the like be tolerated, for such persons do not represent the will of the people but only their own, which they protect through purposeful legislation. This alone leads to the fact that the rulers, for they are the ones in question, can make themselves taboo by means of appropriate laws and disregard the will and personality of the people with impunity. For this reason alone, parliamentary governments of any kind are false and misleading, for they contradict the true meaning of free and comprehensive democracy, which is that the people alone have to decide and determine all things comprehensively. A parliament, if it is to be comprehensively democratic, must only implement the firm will of the people, and this without being allowed to make its own decisions or add or change ingredients in any form. If any referendums are to be held, then they must be held in a democratic manner and in such a timely manner that the whole people can be informed about the whole thing, both positively and negatively. And this must be done without allowing propaganda and publicity to influence the decisions of individual citizens. That is to say, without allowing them to decide for or against something at their own discretion, according to their own reason, their own reason, and their own responsibility. Only in absolute crisis and emergency situations should it be possible for the only representatives of the people elected by the people to act in a self-determining manner, but also only in conjunction with a specialist committee of 7 persons pre-selected by the people, which is to be determined and appointed for all cases together with the nomination of a 7-member body of representatives of the people in order to be present and give advice in crisis and emergency situations. But this is not the case in a parliament, nor is it the case with self-deciding rulers. In parties, senates, and other governmental organizations, as a result of which everything is handled undemocratically, and the people are deceived and excluded from many decisions. A true democracy means that power lies solely with the people, and that the people alone are entitled to it. Consequently, parties, rulers, the powerful, the hierarchical, and other rulers are not allowed to decide on any matters independently or even to make propaganda for their ideas. If any things and facts, etc., have to be decided by the people, then the people is to be guided only by the true facts and by the positive and negative aspects of the matter in hand, according to which, without outside propagandistic influence, every person of the people must decide negatively or positively at his own discretion, according to his own reason and intellect. Any other form, such as the existence of a party, a senate, a government, or a parliament, etc., means that it is through them that the decisions are ultimately taken and implemented, and this in the absence of the people, so that the people cannot directly influence everything. A true democracy, however, looks different. For such a democracy can only exist through the direct participation and determination of the people, but not through those who govern, those who rule, those who have power over the state, as well as through parties, parliaments, senates, and other organizations acting in the same way, etc. All these forms correspond to nothing more and nothing less than underhanded power apparatuses and undemocratic machinations, legalized by these forms of government themselves, by which the people can be determined and acted upon to the exclusion of the people and outside their will and property, and without the responsible rulers being called to account. They can also cause wars or impose the death penalty, etc., as well as countless other wrong things without the people being able to vote against them or do anything about them. This, however, corresponds to a dictatorial arbitrariness exercised with unrestricted and often despotic violence, far from any real democracy. So the people have no choice but to mutter and grumble at everything, if they do not want to be punished in any way by the henchmen of the representatives of power. And if there is a partial democracy in which the people have a say in certain and often only unimportant matters, for example through elections, then this corresponds to nothing more and nothing less than an outward sham democracy, which falsely creates the illusion of a true democracy. In such a case, the people have no choice but to submit to the pressure of the situation and put on a brave face as a false democracy. Despots and dictators usually elevate themselves to the position of absolute power over the people, while where there is a parliament, etc., a party or coalition of parties, or a constituency influenced by them, appoints them. Other methods can also play a role, but the end effect is the same. Namely that the appointment of a parliament, etc., creates an undemocratic or partial democratic form of government, which is never compatible with true democracy. The people cannot therefore decide for or against a form of government according to their own discretion, reason, because they are influenced and divided by the propaganda and publicity of the parties and the parliament, etc. Thus it follows that it is not the individual citizen of the people who, at his own discretion and will, or even at his own decision, votes for or against a cause, but merely raises his voice according to the will of the parties and parliament, etc., and acts accordingly. Thus it is that it is not the people who decide on matters, on their good and bad and on their destiny, but only one or a few who have been given the instrument of power of government, but who should fundamentally exercise and fully represent the will of the people. This means, however, that the parties and rulers are not close to the people, but that they only represent their own interests and enforce them with power, force, and coercion. Thus, because there is no organizational connection between the parties, rulers, ruling powers, state powers, despots, dictators, regimes, and the people, no democracy can come about, and the rulers cannot represent the people either. But the exact opposite is what true democracy demands, namely that the leaders of the people, and such leaders can and may only be appointed or elected by the people, appear as representatives of the pure will of the people and are in direct contact with the people. This requires a real democracy, but not that the people be isolated from their representatives, respectively their leaders, as is the case with all undemocratic forms of government, and that the people have little or nothing to say in all matters concerning the affairs of state and the leadership of the people. An undemocratic form of government, then, means that the people are completely or, in the case of partial democracies, partially isolated from the affairs of government, and that the rulers are granted immunity which gives them an absolutely free or partially free hand for everything and anything they do. But these are undemocratic rights which are granted only to the rulers, not to the individuals of the people, respectively not to the people themselves. In this way, the undemocratic forms of government are an instrument for the exploitation of the people and the appropriation of popular power, whereby the people are forbidden any right of resistance under threat of punishment. It is a fact that if, as a result of the decisions of Parliament and political parties, or of the machinations of other organs of power, there is a result which gives rise to a form of government, such as a parliament or any other form of government, instead of a democratic representation of the people, then it is not a true representation of the people and the will of the people, but a principle of undemocratic government over the people. In this way, the parliament, the parties, or other organs of power are the true powers over the people and represent only their own principles and everything they desire. In this way, they represent themselves and not the people, and thus they are the self-appointed executive, or respectively the executive power in the state. This applies to the parties. The parliament to all rulers, state powers, despots, and dictators, etc. of every form. For all of them, they do not represent the people, but only themselves and their own interests. If they are parties and parliaments, etc., they usually form coalitions, associations for the purpose of promoting common interests and objectives. This creates a power of association from which the people are excluded. Consequently, in such a system, the people become the victims of those who govern, who are the only ones still undemocratically holding the scepter and ruling in a parliamentary and partisan or dictatorial manner, etc., while the real will of the people is excluded from it and is not even or only partially questioned. If this happens, the people are exploited and deceived no matter what form of government is used. The whole thing can only be prevented by a true democracy, because only this democracy is based on the pure will of the people and is so enduring that it also brings about real peace and freedom for the human beings and for all peoples. True democracy also determines that peace can prevail, but that war cannot arise from hatred, revenge, retribution, religious delusion, racism, greed, etc. But all forms of government which do not have a true form of democracy are systems of discontent and division and of stultification of peoples, where the human beings are persuaded and misled by propagandistic lies and slander, and where it is also possible to buy or falsify votes in elections. It should also be borne in mind that, as a rule, in such election campaigns, only those persons who have sufficient financial means to conduct and win large-scale election campaigns can exercise their power and be elected, while financially or in terms of the expression of their speeches, weak persons have no chance of obtaining government office. This, then, is what we Pleiaren understand and cultivate by democracy. There is much more to be said about this, but what is said should be enough to understand the form of democracy as it rightly must be.
Thanks. Actually, I would like to say something more about that, and also ask something.
Of course you can.
The EU, respectively the European Union, as far as I know, it has no democratic traits whatsoever, right?
The European Union is an organization of economic and anti-grassroots hostility and is only run by the powers of the state or the governments of the member states respectively. It is nothing more and nothing less than a modern dictatorship oppressing peoples and their rights without any democratic laws, regulations, directives, etc.
I agree with that, as do many others. If we look at the forms of government today, at least in those states where there are no longer any actual dictatorships, many things have become better than they were in the past, when the human beings and peoples were still treated like inferior livestock, enslaved, lent, exploited, and mistreated by the rulers, state powers, by kings, governors, vultures, conquerors, kings and emperors, as well as by despots, tyrants and dictators, etc. Throughout the ages, the human beings who were free thinkers, writers, wise men, prophets, do-gooders, philosophers, etc., who conceived and demanded democratic forms, were shouted down, imprisoned, tortured, murdered, and silenced by the powerful. Thus, in the earlier and rather undignified era of trodden human rights, the human being's traditional desire and longing for real freedom, for peace, harmony, and for democratic popular rights and for democratic governance was nipped in the bud by evil violence. And this was so despite the fact that the peoples had always hoped for humanity from their evil, brutal and contemptuous rulers, which was, however, a pointless undertaking, because such wishes were usually not only rejected, but punished with torture and death. But time advanced, as did the popular will for freedom, peace and justice, etc., and consequently, as time passed, the peoples rose up against their despots, dictators, and other rulers and ruled and fought hard to achieve all that they hoped and desired. This led to the creation of states, such as republics, etc. But these too were not fully democratic, but also only partially democratic. And this has been maintained until the present day, so that the whole thing can still be extended to full democracy. The truth of the matter is that the current systems of government, which have not yet been fully democratized, mean that in relation to the mass of peoples, only a few powerful states govern the respective peoples in a representative way, instead of the peoples themselves. And if I look at your Pleiaren direct democracy, in which only your peoples and no rulers rule, then it is to be said that at best only partial democracies, but no direct democracies rule on earth. This means, however, that peoples in which there are partial democracies do not have full control over all things themselves, but that parliaments, senates, as well as the rulers and their parties, can in certain respects determine and act on their own authority, which is contrary to a direct democracy, as you yourself have explained, and as is the case with you, Pleiaren. So any form of partial democracy is inadequate and can be developed further. For such a form is as outdated as the old despotic and dictatorial and other forms of rule and government directed against the people. Only when power belongs entirely to the people can we speak of a direct and full democracy. And if I consider everything you have explained, and what your father Shvath told me, to be correct, then the old despotic, tyrannical, and dictatorial forms of government continue to exist in certain partial democratic states, at least in those states in which, in various respects, in matters to be decided, led, and acted upon, these are not determined solely and exclusively by the power of the people, but also partly by the rulers.
That is correct.
To what I have said, however, it must again be made quite clear that I am referring only to your understanding of democracy, and to what you have explained and what Shvath has also said. But it also refers to what has happened on Earth in the past and what is the case today. For my part, I do not wish to interfere in politics in any way, not even in my own country, Switzerland. But my words should be no more and no less than a statement of what you play are and understand by democracy and how you handle it, precisely in accordance with your and your father's earlier statements. But my speech is also about, as I have already explained, what was happening on Earth in the past and what is happening today.
This is clear and plain. And if, in spite of this, any person dares to accuse you of what has been said, of political or subversive thoughts and diatribes, etc., it is out of pure malice and in a lying and slanderous manner against your personality, your ideas, and your attitude.
A good word, for I have no desire to engage in political or subversive activity, either in my home country of Switzerland or anywhere else in a foreign country. Besides, the speech was only possible because Occam Wolf is interested in the whole thing, and I also wanted to know a little more about your Plejaran democracy. But now a question about the slanderer, who has been publicly slandering me for well over 20 years all over the world in an idiotically stupid journal, on television, and for years on the internet, and who has been calling me a liar, cheat, charlatan, and swindler, also in the rotten connection with my ex-wife and one of my sons. You promised me some time ago, in response to a question from me, that you would try, as did your daughter Simyase in another case, to find out through the level Arahat Athersata what personality he had in his former life and what he had been, etc.
I was going to come back to this. But now that you are talking about it yourself, in fact, through the Arahat Athersata level, the former personality of could be identified, and that person existed as Florian Bach.
I will not mention the name of the slanderer, but will replace it with 3 dots when I recall and write down our conversation, because you know that in Switzerland we are openly forbidden to mention the names of persons with regard to facts, and thus with regard to the truth, because otherwise they can sue in court and usually also win. Unfortunately, we Swiss are enslaved in this respect, which also in no way corresponds to a true and direct democracy. Because in such a democracy it should be possible to speak the truth publicly and to openly name criminals, liars, cheats, swindlers, perpetrators, and slanderers by their names and correct designations. But only the slanderers and criminals, etc. themselves are allowed to do this, and the courts will help them and give them the right to sue, while those who openly and honestly denounce will be punished and deprived of the right to freedom of opinion and the right to present facts and truth.
This is all known to me, and you have experienced it yourself several times. So, the former personality, respectively, the person who existed in his last life of the person living today, was Florian Bach, who, besides other false names, also took the name Emil Wallenberg from a novel, with the result that he died in Neukitchen on the 18th of October in the year 1893 by the jury court for an attempt to rob and murder a shoemaker's apprentice in August 1877. He had not committed this crime, but someone else, namely a day laborer named Johann Skarke. And only by using his correct name to identify himself and his data could be verified, Florian Bach escaped this punishment. Florian Bach was born on the 14th of July, 1863, in Bavaria, and was a good-for-nothing and criminal. At an early age, he was put in a reformatory in a place called Breitenau for several years, after which he became a tramp and hobo and worked as a beggar, thief, and burglar in Germany and Austria. Judged by the courts as an incorrigible antisocial element, he was sentenced to prison in over 50 cases. That is all that was communicated to me.
That's also enough, even if it is not connected to a murder like the case Simyase mentioned in 1976. But the bad character of this Florian Bach is obviously also in the successor broken through, just in a different way. According to the dates mentioned above, there was only a short stay in the afterlife from the old to the new personality, which is perhaps the reason why the present personality, respectively person, is still strongly affected by the impulses of Florian Bach, which are stored in the memory banks and which he uses for his bad machinations because he is not able to control them.
This possibility may be true. But now, dear friend, I must go my way again because my duty calls. Goodbye.
Goodbye.